Combat Control Training Experience, Chapter 2, Combat Control Orientation Course, Week 1, Medina Air Force Base, San Antonio, Texas. On the other side of Lackland Air Force Base, where basic training was conducted, we arrived at Medina. We had more freedom than basic training, but we still fell under the rules of the regular Air Force candidates. We still could not leave the base with civilian clothes on for 6 weeks. If we left the base, we had to be in our dress blue uniform. Just to go out and grab a beer, we'd have to wear our uniform. Some guys didn't mind, but I refused to leave the base wearing that. I felt weird going out in public wearing it. On a Saturday, we arrived at the place that would be our home until we received the Scarlet Beret, or we quit. But we still had to wait until Monday before we'd meet our instructors. I was immediately immersed in the unique culture that is Air Force Special Operations. We stayed on the first floor of a 3-story building that was assigned specifically for combat control trainees. On the other floors were trainees waiting for new jobs that had either quit, gotten seriously injured, or failed the standards prior to graduating with a beret. They varied from guys who had quit in the first few minutes of training to getting hurt at combat control school. For military standards, the Air Force barracks were fairly nice. The building wasn't new, but in decent shape. They were exactly like the college dorm rooms that a few of my friends lived in back at college, MTSU, with the same faint smell of an old building and small rooms built for 2 people containing 2 twin beds. I'd have a nice view of the old Texas oak trees out of my window for a while, I hoped anyway. There were several guys waiting for us in the barracks. They waited to be the first people to transition us from airmen to cones, a term the instructors would call us. CONE was a backwards acronym for Enlisted Non-Operational Controller. Guys who had failed physical standards, had medical issues, or were injured and waiting for a new class were there to show us how the culture worked, while the actual quitters stayed far away. The cones were there to tell us the horror stories of the first few weeks of training, along with how crazy the instructors were. The setback cones were waiting for another chance at the 2-week orientation course, Air Traffic Control School, Combat Control School, or Survival School. And they carried on a tradition that the instructors did not talk about or want to know about, although the instructors knew it happened. The setback cones put us through some activities before we went to bed that night. We did activities the trainees had already learned in the course. We did the wheelbarrow races down the hallway, while the setback cones held our feet, and we ran with our hands down on the carpeted hallway. Some of the really experienced cones wore their gray sweatsuits that signaled they made it all the way through Air Traffic Control School and were waiting on Combat Control School, or CCS. Some wore their brown t-shirts. That meant they'd graduated the orientation course. Most of the cones wore the white t-shirts like all of us new guys that just showed up, which meant they were waiting to do the orientation course all over again with us. I looked at the guys wearing the gray suits with admiration because they had been in the pipeline for a while. Some of them had seen the infamous CCS and went through Hell Week. After some games in the hallway that were surprisingly hard, the setback cones took us into the day room. It was basically a meeting place in the middle of the barracks on the first floor, with a big screen TV and couches to hang out. They took a giant rubber rocket fin, which we later used to swim for miles, and had each of us pull down our shorts. They swung the fin at our bare ass, with the large big screen TV on mute, silently displaying King of the Hill. A loud crack of an ass being smacked went off every few seconds. 3 swings landed on my bare exposed ass, sending a stinging sensation through my body. We called each other by last names in the military. I didn't even know most guys' first names. Our last name was stenciled on our t-shirts, sweatshirts, and all of our gear. I met 2 guys named Bronson and Maggio almost immediately after I arrived at Medina. Bronson was from Connecticut. He was very loud and outspoken, and I found him hilarious. He had a skinny but muscular build with blonde hair that he kept just short enough to be in regulations. He would turn up the music on his phone in the bathroom shared by all of us, and he played music by Jack Johnson. He had been set back for something in the water during the orientation course, so I made sure I listened to him intently whenever he spoke about anything. I shared a room with Maggio, a shorter, stocky Italian guy from Ohio, an Ohio State wrestling champ. He was a quiet guy. I could tell he was physically aggressive, but he usually did not speak much at all. Maggio had almost the same exact build as myself, just an inch shorter, with a lot of upper body strength and agility. He had the typical Italian look with olive skin and thick black eyebrows. Besides the hazing being forced upon us, the rest of the weekend was spent relaxing. Our conversations, focus, and world became CCT. The pipeline and all the lingo that went with it was forced upon me, and I became excited and liked being a part of something special. Only after being immersed into this culture did I realize how big of a deal the business was going to be. Being ignorant to what CCT actually did made it easier to sign up for the serious job. Sunday night, before meeting the instructors for the first time, my nerves almost got the best of me. The scramble of getting into the program was over, and I was able to understand better what I'd gotten into. As the music played from Bronson's phone in the bathroom, he stood in front of the bathroom mirror shaving what seemed to be nothing. He could have probably gone days without shaving and nobody would have noticed. Bronson turned to me and spoke in his thick northeastern accent. "Dude, I heard a guy is coming back from airborne school." He smiled. "He broke his leg and had to have pins put in it. He's done." I tried not to seem concerned because one of my biggest fears was jump school. And now Bronson was telling me someone got fucked up. "Damn, that sucks," is all I said. "I was tripping balls when I heard that," Bronson said. He began to laugh. "This is going to be fucking crazy." The CCT schoolhouse was separated from the pararescue, or PJ schoolhouse, which was larger than ours and looked like an airplane hangar. The two units used to train in the same building that sat on the very top of a hill, up from the new CCT schoolhouse at the bottom. The PJ course was more popular and attracted more candidates than CCT. So they kept a large building when the two groups were split, just before I had arrived. Across the top of the PJ building were large letters spelling pararescue, and I'd seen it in a few books I'd found about Air Force Special Ops. Near the entrance of the schoolhouse was a padded area for exercising, and the famous climbing rope that was also pictured in many books. At the top of the rope was a bell to ring when you got to the top. We'd use that rope later in the course. There was a PJ and CCT schoolhouse on every Air Force base where the training was conducted. And it was a meeting place for classes. They had classrooms, instructor areas, and front office areas. Like the PJ building, the CCT schoolhouse had a tan metal exterior. It had the CCT emblem painting on the front that pictured the scarlet beret and a lightning bolt. The building was way smaller than the PJ building and looked more like a small shed compared to it. PJ and CCT are some of the hardest programs in the military. The PJ still conducted the 10-week NDOC course. The course was a gut check for sure, but it also included pass or fail standards and was one of the hardest parts of the pipeline. It was essentially a pre-combat dive course, as they thoroughly tested your physical and mental strength in the pool by putting guys through different pass or fail standards to get ready for dive school. That was a course I thought I was attending when I signed up, until the instructors informed us of the change. CCT now did a 2-week gut check and saved some of the official parts until later, so we had time to build our bodies up. It was an experiment with hopes of getting more candidates through the course. This unfortunately didn't happen, and the course was redesigned again a few years later. For us, combat dive would come later after our hardest school, combat control school. Combat control school was placed near the end of the pipeline, and for us was used as a selection program for the entire course. Monday morning, we formed up in the barracks. We were going to move in formation down to the schoolhouse. We were wearing our standard workout gear, which was very short black shorts and a white t-shirt with our name stenciled across the front. The setback cone showed us how to move to the schoolhouse that morning. We ran together in a formation, all 40-something of us. We sang combat control songs as we tried to calm our nerves of our first meeting with the instructors. We had a rucksack on our back that contained our field battle dress uniform, or BDUs, dive mask, rocket fins, an inflatable dive buoyancy compensator, underwater demolition team shorts, or UDTs, and a diving weight belt. These items were labeled with white tape with our last names written on it. The team captain and the other officers who trained alongside the enlisted, which is a unique detail of special ops training, led us down to the schoolhouse. The officers went through the exact same course as the enlisted men. There was no special treatment given to them. In fact, they had it harder. Not only did they have to go through the exact training as us cones, but they also had to go through a brutal screening phase before the pipeline began. They were expected to lead and motivate us. I had a lot of respect for them because I couldn't imagine worrying about anything other than myself throughout the training. We met the instructors that morning and started the first day of what would hopefully be a long cone career. We ran up to the front of the schoolhouse to an area with big rubber mats used for working out and waited. We waited in pure silence on a warm, overcast morning to greet our instructors. The distinct look of Texas actually looked nice to me. Instead of thick woods and undeveloped areas like back in Tennessee, there were wide open plains with different kinds of hardwood trees. There always seemed to be some winds blowing through the grassy fields. We stood in front of the schoolhouse on the mats at parade rest for quite a while. We stared into the dark windows, hoping we could see movement inside, and I started to wonder if anyone would ever come out. Finally, the front door swung open. 3 men walked out of the building. They were all dressed in black sweatsuits with the small CCT logo on the front and the word instructor written in white across the back. "Team, attend hut!" the captain yelled. We stood at attention as the instructors walked out like sharks circling their prey. Sergeant Sampson immediately looked right at me. He was taller than I was, with a stocky, athletic build. He looked like a bigger version of myself. He had wavy black hair that I could tell he fixed just right. His large, prominent chin and nose made him look like he was genetically engineered to be a CCT. He turned his attention to the other men as he walked around. He made funny faces when he looked at some of the guys and saw their names. Sergeant Sullivan looked friendly, and he also resembled G.I. Joe. Around the same height as Sergeant Sampson, he had no hair. His head was shaved to the skin. It shined in the outdoor light. He looked like he was in fantastic shape. I later saw him run 3 miles in 17 minutes. With his muscular build, it seemed unreal that he could run so fast. Although he looked friendly, I could tell he may rip someone apart in a moment's notice. Sergeant Paciente looked very normal. He looked of Hispanic descent and had a smaller, skinny build. His dark brown eyes were piercing and cut through you. I usually could stare into people's eyes, but I could not hold his stare. His hair was long and black and swept over to the side. To me, he was the most intimidating presence I'd come across in my life. He barely said a word when the other instructors started talking. The other two went directly to the point about the orientation course. When I heard the word orientation, I thought of an introduction to CCT that would be a few weeks of getting educated on what we were getting into. I was correct on that, but I had no idea what it would really be like. The change from the 10-week NDOC course was new, so there was no structure to the course at the time. The course was going to be a gut check to see who was worth investing the time and money to become a CCT. The instructors had us do things that later on would be stopped. The course would evolve into a structured introduction, but early in its infancy, it was just whatever the instructors decided to throw at us. After our brief education, we were loaded up into a big blue government van and went to the Medina pool. That pool would be one of the most dramatic places in my life. On the way over, I was not too worried. I had heard the course was much easier than the old 10-week NDOC course, but I soon had second thoughts. In a hurry, we made our way into the indoor pool. It was warm and humid inside the pool area with a strong smell of chlorine. We were scrambling to do what we were told. Our voices echoed loudly in the indoor pool area. Even our quiet conversations seemed loud. We placed our equipment in the specific order the instructors wanted, with our rocket fins neatly placed on the pool deck and all the other gear neatly placed on top. The large oval dive mask was placed at the very top. "Team, attend hut!" As the captain shouted, his voice echoed loudly off the walls. As we all stood at attention on the pool deck, I was getting a little nervous about holding my breath, as I felt my heart beating hard. I was a terrible swimmer without fins, so I hoped we put them on quickly. I glanced over at Bronson, and he smiled about something. That eased my mind a lot for some reason. Sergeant Sampson was the only one who began talking, as the other two inspected our gear. He walked over to the guy I never got a chance to meet because he left so early. The guy had a weird last name that must have been hard to pronounce. Sergeant Sampson stepped in front of him and smiled. "What's your name? Pikachu?" Sergeant Sampson asked. "Negative, Sergeant!" The guy shouted way too loud. "Why are you spitting on me, Peekaboo?" Sergeant Sampson calmly asked. His smile was fading. The guy did not answer. "What the fuck? It's the first day and you're spitting on me?" Sergeant Sampson asked. "Negative, Sergeant!" The guy's voice carried loudly and repeated a few times off the walls. Then the silence continued. It was too quiet. "We're going to see where you are with your pool skills," Sergeant Sullivan said. "Everyone put on your BDUs and your BCUs," he instructed. I knew our camouflage BDUs and deflated BCU, when inflated, helps bring a diver to the surface, created a ton of drag. We immediately grabbed our uniforms out of the rucks and dressed over our shorts and white t-shirts. We grabbed our masks and sat down on the edge of the pool deck. The setback cone showed us the proper way to enter the pool every time. We put our right hand on our mask, while the other hand was placed on our side to replicate holding our dive equipment. The instructor shouted, "Enter the water!" We looked left, right, and then straight down, leaned over the side to fall into the pool. They were trying to teach us serious dive procedures early. We practiced that many times in the barracks, but we still messed it up. The instructor seemed irritated. We were all supposed to fall in at the exact same time, also turning our heads left and right in sequence at the same exact time. But we screwed it up, and the instructor seemed irritated. "Attention to detail!" Sergeant Sampson screamed so loud it froze me. "That shit will get you killed when you're diving. Count off by 3. Counting off by 3 meant the first man 1, the next guy 2 and 3, and then back to 1. 1, 2, 3. Everyone counted down the pool side. I was number 2. "We're going to start off with a 50-meter underwater swim," Sergeant Sullivan said. "It is all the way down, touching the crack in the deep end, and all the way back. You do not push off the wall, but you can on the turnaround. You don't come up unless you're dead." It was a 25-meter pool, so there was no push off in the beginning, but we swam all the way down and touched a crack on the bottom, and we could push off the other side. Sergeant Sullivan's voice was low, but it was strong and commanding. It was hard to hear because the walls were echoing every syllable. All I could really think was that they were joking. "One's ready!" Sergeant Sampson shouted. "One, Sergeant!" The one shouted back, and then there was silence. "Go!" All the guys that were number 1 on the count-off disappeared under the water. I watched as the instructors carefully monitored and walked the pool edge. They were in shorts with no shirt on, so I could tell they would jump in if needed. It was complete silence until one guy popped out of the water before even reaching the 25-meter mark at the other end. "Are you dead?" Sergeant Paciente asked the panic cone. "Negative, Sergeant!" The guy was taking a large, dramatic breath and seemed like he couldn't even swim. Several cones popped to the surface of the pool on the way back from the wall. The instructors just started shaking their heads in disappointment. "Pathetic!" Sergeant Sampson shouted. There were 2 figures making their way to the finish point back to the wall, still underwater. I knew it was Bronson and Maggio. Sergeant Sullivan jumped in and headed straight for Bronson. Bronson was barely moving. Maggio was still moving fine, just behind Bronson, with slow, methodical movements. Sergeant Sullivan grabbed Bronson by his BDU shirt and pulled him to the finish, back to the starting point of the pool. As he came up, Bronson looked almost dead. His eyes were rolled back, only showing the whites of his eyes. That scared the shit out of me. "You made it," Sergeant Sullivan said as he smiled. Maggio touched the finish and came up. He looked a bit dazed, but otherwise he seemed fine. "Who's that?" Sergeant Sampson asked. "Maggio," Sergeant Paciente said in an Italian accent. Almost immediately, Sergeant Sullivan shouted, "Two's ready!" "Two, Sergeant!" I barely shouted, trying to get one more good breath. It was quiet again, and all I could hear was my heart beating. It was my first test, and I didn't want to screw it up. Go! The shout echoed as I stood there for a while longer. Go! Sergeant Paciente screamed directly into my ear as he knelt down. I drew one last breath and went underwater. As I went underneath the water, a calm, quiet world engulfed me. I heard no echoes or screams. I didn't feel the chaos that was beginning above the surface. I was actually surprised by how calm I was. I was never that calm in all my failed attempts of a 50-meter underwater swim in ideal conditions back at the MTSU pool. I always made it about 40 meters, almost all the way back, but eventually I gave up. In the Medina pool, I had on BDUs and a deflated dive vest, along with the near impossible distance. I got to the other side and touched a crack between the floor and the wall. I turned around and pushed off as hard as I could and tried to glide as far as possible. I didn't get very far. The drag was incredible. I saw lots of bubbles and people bolting up for air. I began to stroke, only looking down. Not seeing how far the wall was actually helped me. When the floor stopped moving, I would do another stroke. I lifted my head and looked for the finish. Damn, I thought. I shouldn't have lifted my head. I began to start swallowing, and I used up my precious oxygen supply. My form became extra sloppy. I decided to go full force with constant strokes, almost like an underwater freestyle. I just wanted to get to the end as soon as the wall was in my vision. The uncomfortable feeling of being out of air was overwhelming as a reflex of swallowing air continued. My gulping sound was the only sound I could hear as I approached full-on panic. Then, out of nowhere, I felt an intense wave of relaxation and comfort. The zen-like state of comfort made me think I was fine, but I was about to experience a shallow water blackout, otherwise meeting the wizard. I saw the wall getting closer, but I don't remember anything after that. The next thing I remembered, I was laying on the pool deck facing up. I seemed to be trying to swallow my tongue, and I was making a sound like I was swallowing too hard. I was making some sort of clicking sound with my tongue. Sergeant Paciente was peering down at me, and I was confused. I was thinking of cartoon frogs, and there was no wizard there. Sergeant Paciente had a smile that looked like he was pleased. That confused me even more. "You passed out, old McDonald. You'll be all right. Go stand over there," he said, pointing at the bathrooms. I stood over in an area that included Maggio and Bronson, and other men who had completed the 50-meter underwater swim. They all looked like they'd already been through war in the pool as they stood there soaked. We had passed the first mind game. I watched as the instructors made the guys that popped up pay a steep price. They made them do an exercise called 10-ups. Instead of swimming lengthwise, the trainees were forced to swim the width of the pool underwater. Every time they got to the other side, they had to jump out of the pool and do 10 push-ups, and then immediately swim the width of the pool underwater again. Each time they got to the wall, they did 10 more push-ups. This went on until a few more passed out. They got smoked in instructor terms. "We're going to smoke some cones," Sergeant Sampson shouted. 6 guys got out of the pool and quit before we even officially started the course. The beginning of the orientation course started off with the same test we had to do to get into the training. It was called the Physical Ability Stamina Test, or PAST. It consisted of a 500-meter swim in under 11 minutes. Then immediately moved on to max number of push-ups in 2 minutes, which was supposed to be like 100, at least 80, followed by max sit-ups in 2 minutes, which should be 100, and max pull-ups with no time limit. I got around 20. We finished the test with a 1.5-mile run on a running track in under 10 minutes and 30 seconds. Everyone seemed to pass this test just fine. After the easy part, we moved on to the real activities. After that initial gut check for the week, nothing else seemed too bad for me. We did a lot of introduction to pull procedures we would use throughout the pipeline. We also spent a lot of time in the classroom at the schoolhouse. In the small classroom, Sergeant Sampson gave us an in-depth talk about some of the missions he had done. He also showed us an aerial video of a bomb being dropped and wiping out several known Taliban members. The video was from an aircraft high in the sky and showed people scattering from the building like ants after the first bomb was dropped. but the second and third bombs wiped everyone out. You could also hear the conversation with the combat controller and the pilot. "That's going to be you guys," Sergeant Sampson said. He always seemed to have a little bit of a smile on his face, like he was about to make a joke. "What about you, Sorry Pinto?" he asked the skinny, dark-skinned guy. Sergeant Sampson mispronounced his name, but we all knew that guy wasn't going to stick around either. "Hoo-yah!" the skinny kid shouted. Sergeant Sampson looked at the kid with a doubtful look on his face. "You're going to be the guy we can trust attached to a SEAL team, keeping up with them on land and water? You're going to know your shit better than they do? You're going to do all that while carrying 100 pounds of gear because you could save everybody's ass when you call in firepower with the radios? Because they're all going to know each other, but you'll be that one Air Force guy," Sergeant Sampson said with a confused look on his face. Sergeant Sampson looked at me and smiled. Then he continued his confused look with the skinny kid. "Hoo-yah, Sergeant!" the kid shouted again, not knowing what else to do. "We'll see, Pissarinto, we'll see," Sergeant Sampson said. His tone was serious. Wednesday afternoon proved to be difficult for me and the rest of the cones, as the course turned from instructional to more of a selection. The instructors played a game of grass and gorillas with us. It sounded like a playful term, but it was intense. It was after this event that I developed the fear of what was coming next. The instructors had our future careers in their hands, and I realized the instructors were extremely creative coming up with ways to bring us to our physical and mental limits. I began to fear that fact after the session of grass and gorillas. I began to worry they would come up with something to break me. What I did not know was that everything they threw at us was just at the limit of being doable, but took every ounce of resolve you could muster to accomplish. The first time I did grass and gorilla drills, that fear had not set in. I was ignorant to how difficult the instructors could make the course. When the event was over, I never wanted to do anything like it ever again. We had a very short time to get changed from our PT clothes to our field BDUs. After the grass and gorilla drills and the pool hazing on Monday, I began to become concerned when we were instructed to put our field BDUs on. On a warm, sunny afternoon day out in the grassy field near the schoolhouse, we started the grass and gorilla drills. There were a few trees that looked native to the area in the low areas down the steep hill we stood on top of. But it was Texas, so there were a lot of open fields with plenty of room for the instructors to smoke us. "Everyone line up at the top of the hill," Sergeant Sullivan said. As usual, he looked serious, and he watched our every move. "Hurry the fuck up," Sergeant Sullivan shouted. The mood felt heavy. "Are you all ready to put out and show us what you have?" Sergeant Sampson asked. He looked at us like we were children. He almost looked like he felt sorry for us. "Hoo-yah, Sergeant!" we all yelled at the top of our lungs. Sergeant Sampson announced the ground rules for the first exercise. We were instructed to do log rolls down a giant hill as fast as we could, all the way to the bottom into the drainage water in between the hills, then quickly sprint back up. Log rolls were fun when I was a kid, so I jumped down on the ground without a thought. "Go!" Sergeant Periente shouted. I jumped to my side and started rolling down the hill. The hill was big, a lot bigger than I remember when I walked up. About halfway down, I was feeling dizzy. I looked around. The only person I saw was Maggio rolling in front of me. I was not trying to beat anyone. I just gave my best effort. I didn't realize at the time, but the instructors paid close attention to that exercise to see who was putting out. They would look to see who put out the most and who was the first one done. I rolled into the mud at the bottom. I was on my back as the world spun around me. I heard the bodies behind me as they rolled down the hill and splashed into the murky drainage water. I felt like I was going to puke as I jumped up and started to sprint up to the top of the hill. Still, the only person in front of me was Maggio as he charged up the hill. I started running as fast as possible. The world still spun around me. I felt terrible as I ran up the hill, but I reached the top and drank water out of my canteen with Maggio. We watched the rest of the team finish. The ones that came in last did some extra training before the next event. 8-count bodybuilders were the punishment. Some of the guys, on the verge of quitting, looked like zombies jumping up and down. We were ordered to go again. I knew what it was like the first time, so I hesitated a bit, but I eventually dropped down again. Once we reached the top, we did it a third time. My pace slowed quite a bit, but I still managed to come in second behind Maggio. Bronson finished close behind me. We moved to a flatter part of the field as we lined up. I could see the discomfort on everyone's faces, and it showed what I actually felt like. We're going to do fireman's carries, and I want you all to put out. Don't be holding back on me, Sergeant Sampson yelled. Who the fuck wants to be here? Show us. The purpose of the fireman carry was to carry someone across your shoulders like they were dead. We had to run across the field and back as fast as possible. I was around 5'9" and about 160 pounds and at a disadvantage in that exercise. Like with the ruck events carrying 100 pounds on my back, I was at a physical disadvantage being 160 pounds against guys that were over 200, carrying that amount of weight for that amount of distance. No matter how strong I physically was, my size held me back with the other guys that weighed a lot more. Pierce, who was about my size but about 20 pounds heavier, climbed and broadened my shoulders as I knelt down. Pierce was not blessed with good looks. He had a face that looked like a beaver with buck teeth he could barely keep in his mouth when it was closed. He was around my size, which was nice, but he still felt heavy as hell after the previous events. He was going to have a free ride and time to relax where I ran to the point of exhaustion. As I lifted him up, I was surprised about how heavy he felt on my back just standing there. Go! I heard the instructor scream. We never leave a man behind. Your buddy is dead, so you take him with you. I took off on a trot and moved ahead of the front of the pack. I tried not to move too fast because the distance to cover was long across the field and back. I heard the instructor screaming because some guys stopped to readjust, take a break, or just not moving fast at all. The noise got further and further away as I continued running. I breathed heavier, my legs felt like rubber, and I began to feel exhaustion and my sides burning. I felt like stopping. I made it to the halfway point and I heard Pierce mutter, "Good job, man, you got this." I went back and forth between walking and running. I thought about the finish line and that we'd have to do it again when we got back, probably a few more times. I blocked that thought out as soon as it appeared. I had never pushed myself to that point before. I could pretend I was unstoppable, but I was reaching a breaking point. I kept running, drool coming out of my mouth. I began to feel sick again, but I reached the finish line. I knelt down and Pierce jumped off. As I stood up, the world went black, but I heard a faint voice yelling. McDonald wants to be here. He's putting out. He's going to go to airborne school first, Sergeant Sampson shouted, with a look of satisfaction on his face. The CCT pipeline was long and arduous. After the initial gut check, there was a series of schools to attend. After the orientation course, there were Survival, Evasion, Resistance, and Escape, or SEER school, and an Army Static Line Jump school. Most guys went to survival school first, but some cones got to go to get their parachute badge first. I had to admit, the Army parachute badge looked very cool in an Air Force uniform. It was not common to see. That further increased my motivation to keep putting out and go to airborne school first. We did the same drill a few more times, and I didn't think I could possibly get my body to move anymore. After a couple of hours of doing the same types of drills, we finished up with some wheelbarrow races. Pierce held my legs as I sprinted across the field using my arms until there was nothing left. When I finally fell onto my shoulders, while Pierce still pushed me along. When it was my turn to run behind him, he collapsed, but I didn't notice. I was pushing him along the grass on his face. "Hold on," he shouted. After the grass and guerrilla drills were completed, our day was finally finished. When we arrived back to the barracks, I felt a sense of euphoria and accomplishment I had never felt before. I wish I could have bottled up that feeling and held onto it for the rest of my life. Wednesday was finally over. It was hard to believe, but I had made it an entire week by Friday, but we were down to about 18 guys from the 40 we started with. They would take men left standing from 2 classes and combine them together to go to airborne, SEER, and then ATC school. We would wait at our home, Lackland Air Force Base, work out 5 days a week and blow off steam on the weekends, and wait for our assigned schools. There were still washouts, especially in the operator course, air traffic control school, and combat control school. After air traffic control school, they would combine 4 rotations of classes to go there, the hardcore selection school. Combat control school had the most washouts because of the amount of information learned, lack of sleep, and grueling schedule. It was one of the hardest parts of the pipeline, despite being almost a year to the training. As I began to understand the process, especially the amount of classes that are combined, it made me realize even more about how big of an accomplishment it would be to earn the Scarlet Beret. I had made it through of a week of easily one of the hardest things I'd ever done. The attitude of the men left standing after that week was that of confidence and humor of children. It was one of my favorite things about the pipeline, hanging out with my teammates, relishing, laughing, and reflecting on what we had just gone through.